Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. That is now 7:30, and you're all very welcome, as you are every Tuesday evening, to the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Centre here in Edinburgh. I see some familiar names and some less familiar names, and it's great to see you in numbers. And we're in for a bit of a treat this evening, I think. I'm just waiting while a few more people come in. I'm quite good at small talk, but it's difficult to have small talk with 60 people simultaneously. You know? Anyway, look, this is great, and there's some old friends coming on. That's marvelous, and lots of new people. Well, look, I'm Lance Butler. I'm the chairman of the Arthur Conan Doyle Centre, and I tend to chair these Tuesday talks, which seem to me to be the flagship of our performance. And we're really lucky, as a flagship, to have a really important person in the field of spiritual and consciousness studies with us tonight. Gary Schwartz has been at it for a very long time. And I have to say that there are turning points as one approaches things spiritual, paranormal, consciousness studies. There are turning points. And one of the turning points for me was when it first came out. I think I waited to receive my copy of Gary's book, which is called, one of his many books, which is called The Afterlife Experiments. And I was attracted to it because lots of people just, in my generation anyway, just needed to know that there were some actual scientists, like as now there are some actual philosophers and psychologists and so on, who are looking seriously at these things which seem to imply that there is life after death, or that there is a spirit world, or whatever it is that they imply. And Gary very much impressed me with that book, and I've slightly followed his career ever since. I'm not going to take up any more of his time, but just to tell you that I do have to share with you that his title is that he's a professor of psychology, medicine, psychiatry, neurology, and surgery. And I don't know what his business card looks like, but I imagine it's bigger than mine anyway. And more to the point for us, Gary is the director of the Laboratory for Advances. Get this title, the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness Studies. And that's really where we're at with Philip Goff and Galen Strawson and Bernardo Kastrup and all the other people, many of whom have been with us. It's Advances in Consciousness Studies that we're looking at. And Gary's the director of that outfit in the University of Arizona, and he's going to talk to us now about really his latest research and his latest thoughts in this area. So, Gary, without more ado, over to you.
Well, thank you, Lance. This is very exciting for me. I think what I'm supposed to do now is to share the screen. So we'll make sure that this actually happens. Is it now visible?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So here we go. First of all, I would like to thank the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Center and Lance and Scott and Anne for inviting me to share this information with you. It really is a privilege, and I've taken this very seriously. In fact, there are aspects of this talk which I've never given before, and I'm doing this in honor of the center and what you're doing. So first of all, what I'd like to do is to dedicate this presentation first and foremost to Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini, which, as many of you know, knew each other in life and had a very interesting relationship. They appear to have continued that relationship in the quote afterlife, and they have played a significant role in our research. I'd also like to dedicate this to Robert Steck. You'll notice it says PhD and also BSI. BSI stands for Baker Street Irregulars, which is actually quite an honor to become admitted to that society. Bob is a psychologist, a research pioneer in application of psychedelics in clinical practice. He also chose to work with me for a number of years. And during the period of time he was at Tucson, he essentially brought us to end up connecting with both Sir Arthur, as we call him, and Harry. In fact, we even published an article on the research of that very first research reading in the journal, the Baker Street Journal, and you can find it if you look for it in 2011. And I'm finally getting a chance to thank Bob overtly. And so, Bob, I think I saw you there, and I hope this does honor all the things that you've done for me, as well as all the fun we've had together. Finally, I want to dedicate this to Carl Sagan. He was a distinguished astronomer, public spokesperson for science, and skeptic. And one of the phrases that he popularized is extraordinary claims require extraordinary ethic. And I've taken his vision very seriously. I call it the Sagan ethic. And I want to suggest to you tonight that this ethic applies to both claims makers and claims evaluators alike. In other words, we have a responsibility to look, if we hear extraordinary claims, to look for and evaluate extraordinary evidence. So here's an overview of the presentation. First, we'll briefly talk about the Sagan ethic. Then I'll briefly mention again the 5 Additive Criteria Test called FACT, which is sort of the logic that I used that ultimately forced me to the conclusion that all of this and more was real. Then I'm going to focus on one of the particular criteria in FACT, which is criterion 2, which is evidence, and talk about the SoulPhone experiments. After that, we looked at that evidence. Then we'll go to part 4, where we'll examine the distinction between proof of the possible, proof of probable, and proof of the practical. And we'll talk about this being a Wright brothers moment, I suggest, in the history of afterlife science, this idea of consciousness independent of the brain, and so on. And finally, I want to leave you with a question. I want us to look to the future. We're going to do an Einsteinian type thought experiment, a Gedanken experiment. I'm going to ask you, who would you with to speak with if you had the technology to do so? What would you ask them, and what would it mean? So here we go. I have to mention, however, one caveat. Very often people give presentations, particularly when they don't know what the length of the time is. They have too many slides. And I have too many slides as well. And I found this little joke here called Death by PowerPoint, which is kind of funny. But what I've decided to do is to include all the slides. In fact, they will be available for you as a PDF. They'll be put on the website, and I think Scott said he'll email to you as well. So this way you'll have all the slides, but I'll cut through many of them very quickly so that we can focus on what's most important to see the big picture of the presentation.
I can't hear him.
So here we go. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. We live in an age where some people call it the post-truth era, where the distinction between what's real and what's not real, what's factual, what's fake, has been severely blurred. And this becomes a significant problem from almost all aspects of society. In 2002, I published a book with an attorney, Alan Borey. The book is called The Case for Truth, Why and How to Find Truth. And there what we did was we looked at the best of the legal system and the best of the scientific system in terms of the methods that they use to try to reach accurate conclusions. And we proposed that this could be of use. I then followed this up with a book that was just published, which is literally called Extraordinary Claims Require Extraordinary Evidence, the Science and Ethics of Truth-Seeking and Truth Abuse. And this really develops the notion of the Sagan ethic and explains how all of this applies to claims makers and claims evaluators alike. And included in this book was the question of survival of consciousness. Now, we live in an era where extraordinary claims are made by people who do research as well. There have been many extraordinary claims made in the history of what's called trans-instrumental communication. One of the well-known books in this area was by Mark Macy called Miracles in the Storm. But a recent example, literally in 2020, that was published as part of a conference on consciousness was Reverend Gary L. Ward is requesting remote control of your screen. I think I have to decline. I apologize here. In her abstract, she made the following claims. She said, in the last 30 years, I've been testing, recording, and have shared thousands of recorded communication, either in voices or images. This area of study is called as instrumental transcommunication and applies either to living persons or dead. English is not her first language. Consciousness does not depend on the physical brain, she writes. Therefore, and I quote, persons in a coma are still able to perfectly communicate, unquote. Now that's a pretty extraordinary claim, and it would be fantastic if it's true, and it might even be true. But if you're going to make such a claim, then you have a responsibility to provide extraordinary evidence for that claim, which is not done. Or here's another one. In the case of our research, we show that, quote, while subjects are sleeping, their consciousness is out of the body, and they are able to communicate and record replies. Again, a fascinating idea, might be true, but it's a claim in the absence of extraordinary evidence. And one of my heroes was Professor Neil E. Miller, who originally was from Yale University. And one of the things he said was, quote, be bold in what you try, and cautious in what you claim. So this is the perspective that I'm going to try to do with you as I provide extraordinary evidence for an extraordinary claim. So the 5 additive criteria test or fact. We could spend 15 minutes to hours on this, but I don't want to get it distracted since I have minimal time. So what I'm going to do is encourage you, if you're interested, to read a chapter on the 5 additive criteria test and its application to the survival hypothesis in a new book. It was published in 2020, edited book by the Academy for Advancement of Post-Material Sciences. It's called In Consciousness Primary. But you'll notice that there are 5 criteria, and I'll just list them. There's logic and theory. There are observations and evidence. There's then community of incredible and trustworthy believers. Then there's direct personal experiences. And then there's the doing diligence of the responsible consideration of skepticism about criteria 1 through 4. These are 5 categories of areas that contribute to belief. And what I suggest is that when criteria 1 plus 2 plus 3 plus 4 plus 5 are all met, then rationally, it is time for us to believe, whether we have difficulty accepting the belief or not. So let's move on to criterion 2, i.e. observations and evidence concerning the SoulPhone experiment. The first paper I published in the area was in 2010. It was published in the journal Explore, which is open to this kind of research. It was called Possible Application of Silicon Photomultiplier Technology to Detect the Presence of Spirit and Intention in 3 proof of concept experiments. We were literally measuring single photons of light in a pitch black environment, a chamber, light tight, and then asking the research medium would invite specific spirits to go into the chamber, and we would try to record tiny increases in photons that were predicted to occur. And there would be an equal number of trials when there was nobody invited to be in the chamber. So we always had baseline data. And we repeated this experiment in this paper. We did it 3 times. And in each case, we got positive results. Experiment 2, I've just shown a graph here because it illustrates the results for individual hypothesized spirit participants, or we call them post-material participants or persons. So you can see a tall black bar here is the spirit intention period, where a given hypothesized spirit was invited into the chamber, versus the smaller bar, which were the matched control baselines. Now you'll notice this one here has the name Sophia attached to it. This set of bars has the name Harry attached to it. The reason why we even use names as opposed to letters was because the then journal editor felt that it was confusing to have spirit 1, spirit 2, spirit 3, spirit 4, and so on. And so we gave them names. What we didn't publish in 2010 is that the name Harry actually refers to Harry Houdini. And Harry Houdini became involved with the research going back to Bob Steck, who started it all, at least with Harry. Replication is critical, and doing so in other laboratories and other technology. So we, for example, did research at a private institute in California. They had what's called the photomultiplier tube system in a Faraday caged room. That was me taking pictures actually of the device with the technician, actually a PhD physicist who was running this equipment. And this is me closing the door. And again, the medium would invite spirits into the chamber and to interact with the photomultiplier tube versus baseline controls. And we again saw the same results. Now, the problem with all these experiments is that there's always a research medium present. The physical experimenters are, let's say, in the next room, but there's always people involved. And one of the questions was it possible somehow that the experimenter's energy or consciousness were directly influencing the results? And it occurred to me that one of the ways to experimentally address this experiment was to get rid of the physical experimenters. So we'd started, that was our first beginning to do research with computer automated experiments where they could be run, for example, in the middle of the night when nobody was physically present, and where the hypothesized collaborators by name were invited by PowerPoint when to appear, when for baseline, when to go into the chamber, and so on. We used when to leave. In this case, we used a $40,000 low light CCD camera system cooled to -70 degrees centigrade to measure patterns of photonic activity in, again, a completely pitch black environment. Here's the summary results of the first experiment. We did 2 experiments, and they replicated. You can see compared to the pre-session data, which were 30-minute sessions, and the post-session, in the presence of spirit, you can see that there's the significantly higher bar. It's even more dramatic when you look at these results into the averaged images. Now, these are 2x2 images, remember, taken in a pitch black environment. So these are all the pre-images averaged over the 2 spirits that were invited to participate and over many nights. Here's the pre and here's the post. They look very similar, but you'll notice, you can see they clearly increased brightness for both Spirit 1 and Spirit 2. And yes, Spirit 2 is brighter than Spirit 1. We also ran similar number of nights. We did all the experiments in the middle of the night, computer automated, but no spirits were ever invited. And you could see that there was no evidence of any effects during the spirit intention trials, indicating that this was not some sort of artifact or time effect. Now, the problem for this kind of research is that it's almost impossible for people to do independent replication. And the criticism always is, well, Dr. Schwartz gets this in his laboratory, but has anybody else replicated? Well, why haven't people replicated these kinds of experiments? Well, first of all, the hardware is very expensive. Secondly, the hardware and software are complex. In fact, they're very complex, requiring specialized knowledge and skills. And third, investigators typically don't have access to skilled research mediums, as well as documented hypothesized discarnate research participants to perform the sensitive and responsible replication. So we spent a few years and finally figured out how to design a computer automated, multi-center, multi-blinded, randomized control trial, evaluating hypothesized spirit presence and communication. And I know that that's a mouthful. This was just published in the journal Explorer. It was in the July-August issue, 2021. I'll read the abstract so we're all on the same page. The gold standard in biomedical research is the multi-center, multi-blinded, randomized control trial. In pharmacological research, the RCT is termed a phase 3 clinical trial. That is the large-scale sample. This paper presents the core goals and RCD methods developed to investigate automated spirit presence communication. The goals are: 1, to use currently available, reliable, and affordable technology. Total hardware cost per system is less than $4,000. These systems would be provided free to use to collaborating laboratories. 2, to automate data collection and real-time analyses employing specially designed software. 3, to only require a quiet space used at night in the collaborating laboratory so as to not interfere with their daily functions. 4, to not necessitate human subjects committee approvals at collaborating institutions because the participants are hypothesized spirit participants, and NIH doesn't even entertain them as deserving protection. And 5, to enable international collaboration regardless of the investigator's personal beliefs about the hypothesis. The research design and methods meet a phrase popularized by Carl Sagan: extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. The design minimizes false positives and false negatives. University-affiliated investigators and established laboratories who regularly publish in peer-reviewed journals and are interested in collaborating in this RCT are invited to contact the author. So this is a picture of the laboratory. You can see there's a lot of parking, which is very convenient. We're in a medical complex called Medical Square, off campus, close to the medical school and the main campus. And these are 4 rooms in the laboratory. And this is actually a portion of my office. And I gave a presentation about this research in 2020 before it was published. This is an example of one of the laboratories where data were collected. And you can see there's a large screen TV that, and there's a desktop computer, which is actually hidden behind this monitor. There's a second monitor here, which is actually a security monitor. It has multiple cameras to make sure that no one is entering the chamber, potentially interfering, attempting to influence the equipment in physical means. In this box, which I'll explain to you, is what's called a plasma globe and a video camera. And this is a monitor where hypothesized collaborators will get instructions. But right now, it shows sort of just very pretty images of what prototypic data look like when physical people do this experiment. So here's again black and white image now of the box covered, and it says, please wait for the next image. And in this case, in this particular study, the yes image was our hypothesized spirits putting their hands inside the box. Of course, we can't do that, but they can. And here I've opened the box so you can see underneath it, this just a conventional plasma globe. We originally purchased ours from the Smithsonian Institute, but they're very readily available, and it turns out they are very sensitive. This is a research quality video camera. We've now gone to using high quality webcams because they do equally well. This classic image, you've seen multiple pictures of it already, is what's called a color enhanced image from the black and white images, when a physical person would put their hands above the box, which is on the left side on some trials, versus putting their hands on either side of the box on other trials. And in this case, the individual frames are averaged. So there are many averages of the individual frames where you've got all these plasma streams going on. And also they're subtracted from baseline images where the person is just sitting, thus creating these very sensitive images where the light is literally attracted up towards your hands, even though there's no physical contact. In fact, it's in this light-tight enclosure, but you can see it's either directed toward the top or directed toward the sides, depending upon hand position. Turns out this is very important because what our research shows is that our hypothesized spirit participants, or hypothesized post-material persons, just different language of the same thing, they produce miniature patterns that resemble these patterns. The goal of the research was a mixture to create sensitive experimental conditions that would optimize replication of the emerging findings, for example, using experienced research mediums as well as research tested hypothesized spirit participants provided by the randomized controlled trial research, and thereby minimize false negative findings. And at the same time, goal 2, to employ appropriate control conditions for blinding both within and between laboratories, as well as safeguards for the integrity of the research. For example, to remove the possibility or the appearance of fraud, thereby minimizing false positives. The design and the software are very complicated. If this were a regular scientific presentation, I would spend 15 minutes going through this. You could read it later. But what I do want to take you through quickly is that the kinds of psychological tests that we've developed, which help make the case that there's some sort of intelligence involved in the interaction with this technology, that they are literally following instructions, they are collaborating with us, and they are meeting the criteria that you and I have to pass when we work in a contemporary world. So the first type of tasks are called response skill tests. In other words, to determine if a given PMP can reliably make a specified yes or no response when requested, e.g. place their info energy hands on the top versus sides of a plasma globe. And then if positive findings are obtained using this very simple task, we go to type 2, what we call cognitive understanding tests, or I'm not a robot tests in the case of like banking. For example, to determine if a given PMP can recognize and discriminate between different classes of things, such as vehicles versus animals, babies versus adults, red versus green colors, odd versus even numbers, etc. And then if positive findings are obtained, we go on to type 3. But let's demonstrate type 2 for you. So what would happen is on the screen, it would come up and say, is this an animal? And then they would also see a picture. And you should see what would you say? Would you make a yes response or a no response to, is this an animal? Versus, is this an animal? Versus, is this an animal? Versus, is this an animal? And of course, the images are all counterbalanced and so on and so forth, so that in order to pass the test, you have to be able to discriminate what an animal is. If that kind of research is positive, then we go to type 3. We call personal identification tests, or I call it the I'm not an imposter test. And this is to determine if a given PMP can reliably identify himself or herself when presented with specific information, such as the name of parents and siblings, birth dates and birthplaces, occupations, for example, physicists, dates and causes of death that fit or do not fit a given PMP. And then if positive findings are obtained, which we'll go to in a second. So let me ask you a question. Is this your mother's name, Frida? Versus, is this your mother's name, Cecilia? Well, if you were one of these two people, one of the mother's names would fit you and the other one wouldn't, and vice versa. And maybe some of you will recognize both of these people and will discover, in fact, what their respective mother's names are. Or, is this your father's name, Mayor, versus, is this your father's name, Militant? Again, if you were one of the two designated persons participating in the research, you would be able to give the correct answer. So one of these people, his father's names belong to one person on the left, the other person on the right. And some of you may recognize these people. Finally, type 4, which we've not yet done, is what I call the advanced knowledge tests. And this is to determine if a given PMP is an expert physicist, for example, by providing specific formulas which are correct versus incorrect. So even if somebody gets details about David Bohm or Albert Einstein in terms of their histories, the question is, do they have the advanced knowledge and skills necessary to do something that only a physicist imposter would be able to know? So how do we collect this data? Well, very, very quickly, I'll do this in 1 minute. These are individual frames, pre-question versus post-question. And the individual frames just look like light, just streams of light. Now, if you average lots of these images, you'll get a blur. And if you look at these things, you would never know that there's any consistent difference here. But if a person puts their hands on the sides of the box, the light is pulled more to the side. You can see that. Finally, it's revealed. And if I colorize it, then it's very dramatic. versus when their hands are in the lap, it looks like this. It turns out to be more equally distributed around the image. You could do the same thing with hypothesized spirit members, but you have to collect lots of trials and many sessions. So for example, here's the data for a physical person, another physical person with their hands on their side, minus the baseline. Here are data from an experiment with hypothesized spirit participants. And notice, and by the way, this had to be amplified substantially in order to be able to reveal the subtle light differences. So this is not on the same scale. The hypothesized spirit is not on the same scale as a physical person, but the no participant controls are on the same scale as the hypothesized spirits. And clear as day, you can see the predicted effect, suggesting that they're having a physical-like effect under controlled conditions. In our very latest research, it's so complicated because we have 4 computers in 2 laboratories. We have simultaneous data collection plus security. We have the capability to literally know what the screen is showing the participant on a moment-to-moment basis. We can video record the whole thing at 24-hour units. The whole experiment automatically starts in the middle of the night and runs through 8 hours. The experimenters who are running the experiment, actually running the equipment, one in this research was in Arizona, the other was in Ohio, a remote laboratory. We were blind to which night, on a given night, the hypothesized spirit team. So if the hypothesized spirit team was invited to the top laboratory, which is Arizona, the bottom laboratory becomes a control. And if they were invited to the bottom laboratory, then this became the active laboratory, and the Arizona laboratory became the control. So you can see that you have very sophisticated capabilities. We measure temperature, we measure relative humidity. So we're truly trying to get as many parameters as possible. All of this data is stored in the cloud. It's virtually impossible, unless you're an expert hacker, to break into the actual data, and so on. Well, we completed validation studies. And a year ago, I submitted a paper to a mainstream journal with the title, Validation of a Computer-Automated, Multi-Centered, Multi-Blinded, Randomized Control Trial, Evaluating Hypothesized Discarnate Presence in Communication. The action editor, and it is his prerogative, made the decision that despite the degree of complexity and sophistication and care and control, that the content did not fall within the scope of their journal, i.e. did not fall within a subset of the journal whose focus is human consciousness. Survival of consciousness was not considered a part of consciousness studies. The paper was never sent out for review. He said, unless you can make this mainstream, we won't consider it. I then rewrote the paper, reframed it, titled it Conceptual and Experimental Methodology for Re-examining the Relationship Between Consciousness and the Brain. But the methods and the results were identical. I then resubmitted this paper. It, by the way, went to a new action editor. He agreed that this fit within the context of methodology and consciousness studies, and he submitted it. He agreed to submit it to review. It is now in the review process, and we don't yet know what the outcome is. This is the abstract of the paper. I don't have time to go through it, but what I want you to see is that we ran a total of 1,004 experimental sessions. Think about this. Talk about large-scale research. Over 1,500 experimental sessions and 864 matched control sessions as part of this research. The p-value is p less than 0.001 or greater, depending upon what statistics you use. So the totality of the research continues to replicate under these extraordinary experimental conditions. So how do we explain this? Do the data justify an extraordinary explanation? Well, there's 6 basic categories of explanation. One is that we always hear the case, oh, this research is just due to chance. I mean, if you actually did real science with this, you'd see that there's no difference under the conditions. Well, chance hypothesis clearly does not fit the data. Statistically, we get these effects over and over. We get replication, we get extension under ever tighter conditions. The chance hypothesis doesn't explain the data. What about fraud? Is the medium involved with fraud? Are the experimenters involved with fraud? Well, first of all, categorically, I've been accused of potentially being engaged in fraud for over 20 years. And initially, it used to really bother me because integrity is what science is all about. It's following the data where it takes you. And I'll never forget when Charlie Tart, a distinguished researcher in America, who's worked in parapsychology, when I first was being accused of fraud, he said, you know, Gary, he said, one of the things I learned, and apparently he heard this as part of a presidential address to the Parapsychological Association meetings, and I don't remember who the president at the time was. He said, when the only argument that someone can make in order to potentially disprove the findings is to say that the experimenter was cheating, then you know you've designed a good experiment. So when the only thing that's left is it must be fraud, then you know you've designed good research. But we keep adding more and more fraud monitoring and security and so on. So the totality is the fraud doesn't account for the data. What about experimenter errors? There are experimenter errors and experimenter effects. And certainly in the very earliest research, when we were running trials by hand and the medium was inviting a particular spirit to come in or not and so on, errors could have been made. But by the time it was computer automated, and then where all the data would go up to the cloud and so on, there's no room for experimenter error. It's all completely regulated. So that doesn't seem to work. So then what are the paranormal and spiritual categories of explanation? Well, the 4th category is typically what people call super psi. Some people don't like that term, but it's basic that parapsychologists will pose extraordinary psi explanations to potentially account for the data. So in our latest multi-center studies, there are some parapsychologists that propose the possibility that even though the experimenters are blind, and even though it's run in the middle of the night, and even though the medium is sleeping, that unconsciously and unbeknownst to the medium, her mind is going to the respective laboratories in the middle of the night and influencing the data to make it look like spirit is producing the effects, as opposed to the hypothesized spirit team producing the effects. Is that in principle a plausible hypothesis? Of course. But is there any data that that level of hypothesis could explain this, particularly when it's connected with all the other research in survival of consciousness? It's really stretching the argument. So what about the notion of, well, okay, it really looks like there's something supernatural, something spiritual, some invisible to the normal senses that's going on here. But how do you know that it's really Harry Houdini, for example, who's participating in the research? Well, how do you know really that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle is really attending research readings and meetings and such? Well, when you start adding, for example, personal identification tests, and then finally, eventually, the expert knowledge tests, it makes it ever more improbable that an imposter would know which spirit was supposed to go under which circumstance, and then they would cheat by trying to replicate or produce what the hypothesized spirits are doing. We haven't ruled it out entirely, but it's highly questionable. So the question then is this really spirit collaboration and communication? My philosophy is that when the totality of the evidence all point in the same direction under ever tighter experimental conditions, that the simplest and most parsimonious explanation for the totality of the data deserves the hypothesis that we accept. That's what's called Occam's razor in a more sophisticated term. It is the criteria that, quote, skeptics use. When the simplest hypothesis, the most parsimonious hypothesis that accounts for the largest amount of the data, handles it under ever more sophisticated conditions. Well, the simplest hypothesis is that it really is post-material beings collaborating, just like you and I collaborate in psychological research. So in the remaining 5 minutes, let's talk about the evolution of this research in terms of what we mean by proof. I want to start with the notion of proof of possible and what we mean by a tipping point. You know, it used to be believed up to the early 20th century that powered flight by humans was impossible. It could not happen. Many people have tried and failed and died. However, on December 17th, 1903, there was the first successful flight, Wright brothers flight. The flight was 12 seconds in duration. The longest flight that day was 59 seconds. It went a little over 800 feet, and the plane would come down and crash. And the fourth time, it literally broke, and then they had to rebuild the plane. This was completely impractical. We had no idea how we would get from this to something that was practical. However, that was a tipping point moment because we now knew that flight was possible. We knew that practical flight was possible. Step one. I and my colleagues believe that we've met the proof of possible tipping point. When you look at the totality of the evidence, this is definitely not a practical device for a Navy hypothesis spirit to communicate with us. But the totality of the evidence, and I've only shared with you a tip of it, no pun intended, points in that direction. And then what you want to do is you want to go from proof of possible to the proof of probable. What I mean by proof of probable is you don't yet have a practical everyday device, but under certain circumstances, you can do much more. 16 years later, on June 15th, 1919, was the first successful transatlantic flight. Took 16 hours, and this person made it across the Atlantic. But look at that plane. There are no windows, there are no stewardesses. You couldn't use this practically for everyday flight, but it was a critical step along the way. So we were going from proof of possible to proof of probable. And what I want to suggest to you is that this is where we are today. And again, I don't have the opportunity to be able to go into this, but we've evolved beyond the plasma globe paradigm, which is a very sensitive paradigm, but is utterly not practical, to ones that are taking us toward the practical. And of course, from proof of probable to proof of practical is, for example, to have the kind of flights that we take for granted today. I looked up a statistic. Apparently, in terms of just commercial flights alone, there are typically approximately 90,000 flights per day that now take place. And we are not obviously here. We're in that probable ways. Another way of saying it, and it's mixing metaphors, is proof of concept, proof of possible is we've entered the tunnel. There's clearly a tunnel and we're in the tunnel. Proof of probable is we're beginning to see light at the end of the tunnel, but we're definitely not out of the tunnel yet. And proof of practical is when that final breakthrough occurs, so that all of a sudden you can leave the tunnel and get into the light and have a technology that can give you a reliable, i.e. 99% plus accurate response, not in hours or even minutes, but within 1 to 5 seconds. Because once you have that, you now have you can create a binary, you have a binary switch, you can create a binary keyboard, for example. You now have texting, what we call a soul keyboard for soul texting, and now everything changes. So finally, I would like to leave you with the following thought. Who would you wish to speak with if we ever create this technology? Einstein was famous for what he called his Gedanken experiments, the thought experiments that he would do with his imagination. He used to say imagination was more important than knowledge. Well, the combination is greater than either one alone. Imagine we're now doing a thought experiment. We've created a successful, accurate, 99% accurate, within 1 to 5 seconds, person can press a key and a letter will appear on the screen. Person, in this case, a post-material person. So we now see texting in real time. And now you have an opportunity to communicate with Albert Einstein, who is, behind the scenes, one of the co-inventors of the technology, i.e., the evidence indicates that he and others are providing advice through mediums about the physics, the greater reality physics, and the ways to bridge that physics to give us guidance because they know better than we do. With whom would you wish to text and why? Would you want to contact Sir Arthur Conan Doyle or Harry Houdini? David Bohm and Tesla, or who would you wish to communicate with? Those kinds of thoughts are no longer fanciful. They're part of the reason why we want to do this work. Now, of course, for the average person, and I said many of you who are listening to this, first and foremost, what you would like to do is to be able to communicate with a quote, deceased son or a deceased mother or a deceased spouse or whatever. You'd first and foremost want to be able to communicate with people that you love, that you loved here on the earth. You would want to be able to maintain your relationships with the people who are most intimate in your lives. And that is a fundamental reason for doing this work. No question about it. But we also have the opportunity to be able to communicate with people who we maybe never met when they were physically alive, but who have inspiration and wisdom and intelligence. People who were, quote, bigger than life in this life, and they appear bigger than life in the next. They cared about humanity. They cared about the planet when they were here. And their love for humanity, nature, and so on has not left them just because their body has gone back to the earth. That opportunity becomes afforded to us if the work can continue. So here's a take-home message. It actually occurred to me this morning as I was reviewing all of this. I was realizing that this is an exciting time to be alive, both here and there. The truth is, it's exciting for people on the other side to be able to either connect with their loved ones or to continue to be of service and do the things they love to help humanity, such as Sir Arthur and Harry. And it's certainly an exciting time for those of us who are alive. My sense is, speaking for Bob, my guess is he would agree that this is an exciting time to be alive, albeit a challenging one. And I know that Rhonda and I feel that way as well. And I think the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Center has the opportunity to play a role in bringing all of this to the world. And if my having been given the opportunity to give this presentation can be of any further assistance to doing so, I'd be honored to help. So finally, we can talk about the evolution of soul science. And as you see, extraordinary evidence for extraordinary claims. For those of you who are interested further, if you want to learn about the Laboratory for Advanced Consciousness and Health, you can go to the website here listed at the bottom, www.lach.arizona.edu. Or if you're interested in the SoulPhone Foundation, which is a 501c3 nonprofit corporation to support this research and advance with funding and with education, founded, one of the co-founders was Dr. Mark Pitstick. You can go to www.soulphone.org or the SoulPhone Foundation.org. And that's it.
Okay. Well, thanks very much, Gary. That was quite extraordinary. I'm amazed you managed to get so much into so short a time. I would just like to ask a couple of very brief preliminary questions before I move to the chat and to the various things I know people want to ask. One thing that struck me just at the end there was, we're almost exactly 100 years after another occasion in European and North American history when scientists were very interested in spiritualism, you know, people like Crookes and the others, who they felt, I think, that they were on the verge of a breakthrough then, don't you think?
Yes.
Arthur Conan Doyle.
Absolutely. And as you know, people like Tesla and Edison, they had visions for developing technology, and they tried to. And they did the best they could with the technology at the time, but it was premature. And now 100 years have gone by. We have so many much finer tools, to put it mildly, you know, ultra-sensitive femtoamps and, you know, measuring single photons of light and so on and so forth. We've got all this computer power in our hands. And so we can reapproach these questions renewed.
Yeah, we do have better kit for doing the research. I think
yes.
Even those of us that didn't totally follow all the intricacies of your science were aware that there was some pretty sophisticated stuff there. And you mentioned only one price of one thing, and you rather dismissively said it only cost $4,000. I'm sure the other thing cost a lot more. You know, as someone in charge of a budget, you know, I shake slightly. But that's great. I'm sure that's right. And one last little thing for me, I think there was something which you almost missed out in this, which is crucial. Did you miss out the step of explaining how it was that, having got this kit set up, you got Arthur Conan Doyle and Houdini?
I very intentionally left all of that out.
Okay.
And I did not at all explain how it was that these individuals found their way to us. I mean, off the record and on the record, there's now over 30 individuals who have been independently verified by multiple mediums, some individuals by 10 or more mediums, independently verified. And virtually all but a couple, they found their way to us. I don't remember, and again, Bob would know this better than I do in terms of exactly how, for example, Sir Arthur and Harry arrived in our lives, because I don't remember all these details. But one that I do remember is that Albert Einstein, and I wrote about this in fantasy, but because I didn't want to confess it, in a book I wrote called The Sacred Promise, 2011. I asked people to imagine that you're Albert Einstein. You realize that you're now alive. You didn't think that life after death was real. And you realize that you have important messages for humanity. And you want to be able to reach humanity. And so the question is, who are you going to try to speak to that's going to listen to you? Because, you know, the average scientist at Harvard or Yale or whatever, they're not going to listen to some medium. I don't care what group she's affiliated with or the like. So who is Albert going to find to that could potentially listen to the information that he says? And then those days there weren't too many scientists who were well educated, and a background in physics, were open to all of this and so on. And it was me. And by 2010, I don't remember whether it was 8 or 10 different mediums independently said to me, Harry Houdini is here, and he has messages for you as well as humanity. And I said, that's ridiculous. I couldn't even imagine it. Plus, you're in enough trouble if you say that a medium speaks to, or you do research with somebody's deceased son. You know, but it's another thing to say you're doing deceased research with one of the all-time famous scientists in the history of humanity. I mean, it just, people's eyes roll up. You reach a boggle factor. And so consequently, you don't talk about it. Anyway, just to answer your point, Albert Einstein, all the evidence indicate that he really, quote, sought me and us out. However, he suggested that David Bohm join the team, and he brought David Bohm to the meetings.
Wow. Okay. Well, that is extraordinary and fantastic. I would ask Scott, if he doesn't mind, would he unmute Bob Steck and Peter Bruin, and we'll take them in that order, because I know that Bob will have something to say about this. I hope he does. And Peter has been enjoying a question on the chat, which has provoked a few things.
Sure. Very, very basically, make a long story short, when I moved out to Arizona and I volunteered to work with Gary after I had retired as a clinical psychologist. And as we wanted to see if we could design some experiments that would be useful. And as a proof of concept, there were 3 people who agreed, who said, let's invite Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, who is a big believer in spiritualism, Harry Houdini, who wanted to believe in contact with his mother at least, but was also very skeptical about physical mediums, and Carl Sagan, who was a very strong skeptic, but yet at the end of his life said, yes, there are some things that we can't yet explain that might, lead us to some other explanations. And we would use a research medium that Gary had been working with and invite these 3 people to visit with us. And in 2007, that's what happened. And I actually gave a presentation at the Sir Arthur Conan Doyle Center twice during the Fringe Festival to talk about how we invited. Sir Arthur came through very clearly. Harry came through. The medium said, I don't see anyone here, but I hear someone. And well, what are they saying? They're saying, now you see me, now you don't. Now you see me, now you don't. And now he's showing me pulling a rabbit out of a hat. And so she, thought, well, he must be a magician, but she did not recognize him as Harry Houdini. And Carl Sagan never showed up. We don't know why.
Okay, thanks. Wow, what an extraordinary experience. You think about it,
Yes. Also, I should just add a little something to this. Part of the reason why I thought there was a possibility that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle might show up, and by the way, the medium was kept blind to all of this, so she didn't know the identities of who these people might possibly come through. The reason why I thought that Schwartz Conan Doyle might come through was because Bob Steck had such a deep relationship. He is an authority. He's a true Sherlock Holmesian guy. And he has such an affection that, you know, I reasoned and do reason that they can know when people really care about them, and they can, and so that there was some bond there that was, you know, clearly, you know, allowable, that was already present, that increased the possibility and even probability that Sir Arthur might appear.
That's a nice sort of humanizing point, isn't it? Peter, is this relevant to what you wanted to say about the moment of communication?
I think it is, because I'm still, thank you for a fantastic talk, Gary. It was wonderful. It blew my mind several times, and I'd like to ask you 2 questions relating to the mind-blowing. The first one is more mundane. It's simply to do with me not understanding what the nature of the invitation was. I know that the medium was PowerPoint initially, but what was the actual invitation itself?
Okay, again, it's a bit complicated. So we have a group of 4 people, for example. We did this with others. We have a group of 4 people, which we call our test pilots. And they have an ongoing relationship with the research medium. And the primary research medium, by the way, very conveniently, is my wife, Rhonda Schwartz, who developed the capability to become a research medium. By the way, she wrote a book called Love Eternal, if you're interested in learning about this. And if you go to the website, the university website, latch.arizona.edu, it'll take you, she's included in the staff and so on, so you can learn about this. And she, quote, works with them, and she can see spirit. Now, that's her experience. If you use a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 was complete and visible, and 10 is how you and I normally see the people in the physical world, she typically gives a rating in terms of clarity of between 2 and 3. So you're dealing with something that's relatively, quote, fuzzy. So they appear to her more like wisps. But again, the totality of the data, we've done brainwave recording, we've had independent mediums verify what she's done. We've done experiments with light and dark, and so on, doing the kinds of things that would potentially rule in or rule out that interpretation. But so now imagine you've got somebody who can regularly, quote, see spirit. And by the way, sidebar, she always says, and which is one of the things I deeply appreciate for her, she says, I don't know if this is my monkey mind, but meaning, could be my imagination, but let me share with you what I'm experiencing. So we never take what she says at face value. We always look for independent confirmation. Anyway, having said all of that, she works with the spirit team so that she explains to them what the task is. She demonstrates for them what this is, and she works out how the invitation is. So for example, with the multi-center double-blind experiments, they know through her to show up, let's say if she's the experimenter with the blinding, they know to show up at 11 o'clock at the Arizona lab, and they know ahead of time that they'll know which person is to be scheduled to run through the 25-minute session, because the audio portion of the PowerPoint will say, calling on Harry, the experiment's going to begin soon. Calling on Harry, and there'll be a pic, on the screen, it'll be saying, Harry, the experiment will begin soon. So they know ahead of time what the instructions are, just like you instruct human subjects. And then they are allegedly present so they know when to start. So it's very much an active collaboration.
Okay, thanks. And Peter, did you have another question?
Yes, I did. If I may, I don't want to take up other people's time, but the most mind-blowing part of your talk was the notion that the assertion that discarnate beings of a very high status are assisting us in making the jump, the quantum leap to the next stage.
Yes.
It reminded me of a review I read in last month's for Tea and Times about a book called Living On by Paul Beard, in which the book suggests strongly that people who have moved on and are of a high status, they become, even if they're very developed already, they become more developed in the afterlife. Yeah. And I'm wondering if that's true of Einstein, for example, if he's able to go higher and to know more than even he knew when he was here. And is that why we're getting quantum computers?
Well, those are a lot of wonderful questions. So I'll try to answer them at least relatively briefly. Number one, talk about an extraordinary claim that would require extraordinary evidence. If I'm going to make a claim that someone like Albert Einstein or David Bohm or Nicholas Tesla or Thomas Edison or any of these people are potentially working with us, I've got a huge responsibility to back this up with data. And I sympathize with people whose eyes roll, who just, quote, mind-blowing. But I can't help that that's the reality. I can't help that that's how the data appears. That's what the data is. Well, we have this philosophy of, follow the data, where it goes. The second point is that we have not spent our time exploring with them their own development, quote, on the other side. We're very much targeted on trying to work with the present and the immediate future to make progress with this technology. Because anytime you start asking these more philosophical questions and so on, then you've got the problem of the beliefs of the medium potentially influencing it. And you have no way of verifying whether she or he is correct, except through independent, validation. And as Rhonda says, she'd rather wait to make the breakthrough and then let Albert tell us directly. That's why you want to have a keyboard. As she puts it, what we're trying to do is to give spirit a voice. That's her language. That's her motivation. Now, if you want my personal opinion based on working with a lot of mediums and witnessing a lot of readings. Now, by the way, I don't see spirit. I don't hear spirit. I am not a medium. In fact, coincidentally, it was Dr. Robert Steck who once labeled me, I don't remember what year it was, but he called me the Helen Keller of afterlife research. I will have a, quote, team meeting either in the lab or in our living room with what we call the A team, or we're the B team. And I'm in the living room. There's one person in the room, it's Rhonda. And the other birds outside and so on. And I'm talking to an empty room. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, nobody's here. And we have a whole protocol where I will ask Rhonda, who's here? Where are they standing? How clearly do you see them? What do you see them wearing? So on and so forth, so that I get some bearing about all of this, knowing full well, not knowing how much of this is, quote, imagination and how much of this is genuine sight. And so, but yet if I don't give her the benefit of the doubt and say, you've earned having the benefit of the doubt, let's just get the information out and then we'll verify through other independent means. It's quite an exciting journey. And one feels very humbled by all of it to be able to be, participate in it.
That's great, Gary. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. I'm going to read out a couple of little comments about Arthur Conan Doyle, which people have put in, which I very much like. And then I got 3 questions to ask. So I'm going to ask Scott if he would unmute Nick Kyle and Christine Smith for a start, and then Robert Grishgorak later on. Anne Traherne is my predecessor, who has some mediumistic connection with Arthur Conan Doyle.
Absolutely.
It doesn't surprise me that Arthur Conan Doyle and others would seek out someone who would listen. He did this with me and unflatteringly told me he was looking for ordinary, everyday people that others could identify with. It was wonderful, and yet, there's another side to it.
By the way, your humility is really appreciated. What I say to people when they pick, I say, why did Einstein pick me? And I said, well, I was really the only game in town. What other choices did he have? So, you know, I'm the one that stuck with it because I was the one that would potentially listen.
I think that's marvelous.
Me too, Gary. Me too.
Hi, Ed.
Hi, Gary. Nice to see you again. Hi.
Yes.
That's great. And Pip writes, I've written a biopic, a screenplay on Arthur Conan Doyle, predominantly on his lifelong interest in spiritualism. During my research, I discovered that Houdini and Arthur were great friends, but fell out famously over the question of existence of life after death. I'm glad to hear they're friends again. I certainly felt that as well. But these are really nice little things, and I think they have their importance. But could I just ask Nick Kyle to pose his question? Well, I can just pose it for him, but perhaps if he's unmuted, that would be good. It's simply, ITC, instrumental transcommunication, where people get voices through radios, they tend not to get clear and extended messages. Maybe you'd like to comment on that, and then maybe Nick would want to say something.
Yes. Boy, I'm glad he asked this question, and that would have been an area that, if we had time, I would go into. What instrumental transcommunication has done is they'll take some piece of technology which is available, some communication technology like radio or television or tape recorders, and then they'll see whether, quote, spirit can somehow figure out how they might influence it in some way to produce some signal. So they have to figure out what it is that they have to do to potentially produce an effect. And that's hard work, and they have to get feedback for it, and they have to have motivation for it. And this equipment is not designed, that equipment is not designed for them. The approach that we've taken is different. We've said, what's the physics of spirit? What do we know about the physical-like properties of spirit? And what kind of technology do we have that potentially they could use, which didn't require them that they learn anything? All they have to do is just engage in their normal behavior, like a normal everyday folk. So for example, if you have a beam of light going across and you and I take our hands and we put it through the beam of light is attenuated. Well, it's literally blocked. The light doesn't pass through our hands. You put a piece of glass in there, particularly a thin piece of glass, the light travels through it, but it's bent slightly. It's distorted slightly. And you can measure that degree of distortion. Now, you don't have to learn how to make the light bend. The glass doesn't have to learn, the hand doesn't have to learn, it just has to do it. Now, we predict that they, like us, post-material persons, that they have, quote, info energy systems. David Bohm calls them, from the other side, he calls them historical systems. They're historical info energy like they had on the earth. That's why they can appear as they did on the earth. They can wear clothing, they can have jewelry and so on and so forth, because they have that history of organization. And Albert Einstein refers to them as expressing living signals. This is according to what Rhonda has received when we've had these kinds of conversations. And so based on, for example, that analysis, we predicted if she sees their hands, for example, moving in and out through a laser beam, she can see them. And in order for her to see them, if it's at all optical, light must be reflected back to her eyes. She can't see them with her eyes closed. She can't see them in the dark, and so on. Then all they have to do is put their hand there. They don't have to figure out how to make the photons block or bend the light. They just have to be present. So every technology that we've tested is where we're designing the technology based on the best theory that we have about how they manifest. And I think that's one of the reasons why we've been able to make greater progress.
Okay.
Because it doesn't require learning on their part.
That's very clear. Thank you. I mean, quite exactly how you do that still remains a little bit unclear, but I really get the idea.
But you get the principle.
Yeah, we get the principle. That's right. That's it. Really important. I hadn't thought of it. I'm going to ask Christine Smith's question, and maybe she'd like to comment after it. She's just asking Gary about where this fits with reincarnation. There is some proof for reincarnation. What happens if the soul you are trying to contact has already reincarnated?
I love that question. I'd like to give like a 3 or 4 minute answer to that because it deserves it, if I might. First of all, we've been doing research on, is there an afterlife? And can they communicate with us, using technology? We have not addressed, for example, in my lab, for example, the question of reincarnation. So and until we understand the process of incarnation, it's kind of hard to understand reincarnation. So at a theoretical level, I'm willing to step back and say, I don't know. But if I put my theoretical hat on, and I'm going to do that for Christine, I ponder the following. The kind of model that I use is based on photonics. We know that light goes out into space. All objects both, emit and reflect electromagnetic signals. They go out into space and they expand. And if they don't bump into materials, they just keep going. Light has a kind of immortality. Now, all that pattern of information is the history of the information and energy of us when we were in physical form. Now, the question is, what's the probability that all that energy and information can be gathered and squeezed into a single cell and then put back within an egg, or squeezed into a single brain? I think it's highly improbable. I think what's more probable, and also is consistent with, as above, so below, and as below, so above, that reincarnation is more like sperm and egg. It's more like a piece of us, our core, reincarnates rather than the whole. And so what that says is, instead of it being life after death versus reincarnation, it could be life after death and reincarnation. It's not either or, it's and. And if it's and, that also helps provide an explanation for some claims in religion for which there's lots of anecdotal data, but which people don't like to think about, such as how could millions of people be, quote, reborn with the Christ consciousness or the energy of Jesus, and yet simultaneously the, quote, unified soul of Jesus, who has continued to evolve, can exist at the same time, and also, by the way, be present, quote, in multiple places at the same time. If it's not either or, if it's and, then even that religious premise becomes potentially plausible.
Yeah.
Wow, that's quite an answer.
You're just not re-embodying the entirety of the soul that's departed you.
Right, but the essence, remember, a single sperm has got all the DNA of the whole body. It just is in a tiny little spot. It gets back to David Bohm and, quote, the hologram. So the all is in the small. Something very tiny could also have the all. That's the working hypothesis.
The other thing I would mention, sorry, Lance, I was just going to mention that I read an article about the nature of angels was an abstract geometry or whatever, but they've got to manifest themselves in physical form in order for humans to see them, that they don't exist in the form that we eventually see them as being, that they exist as an abstract, kind of essence.
Yeah, especially if, quote, they've never incarnated, so they don't have a specific historical system, or historical form. By the way, for those of you who are interested in, quote, the angel hypothesis and how you can extend the afterlife experiments type research, both with mediums and technology, to address the angel hypothesis, I address that in part 4 of a book I wrote called The Sacred Promise, How Science is Discovering Spirit's Collaboration with Us in Our Daily Lives. And it was because I started doing exploratory work on that hypothesis, because it's testable and it's important. I got into even more trouble with my parapsychology colleagues.
I can well imagine. Okay, thank you, Christine, and thank you, Gary. Absolutely.
And thank you. Thank you. I wanted to thank him and say it was a lovely talk. Thank you very much.
That's a very good thing to do. Arkadiusz from Poland, who joined us from Poland, has asked me to ask his question because of his microphone. It really follows on from the one we just had. He says, if consciousness is primary and not the product of the brain, which I think almost everybody here probably now thinks, have you tried to contact with SoulPhone the part of your own consciousness which doesn't inhabit your body? I think this is a great idea from an experiment, because you can get the best support and help from this part of you, which is not bound by place and time. That's a bit of a corker of a question, isn't it?
It is a delightful corker of a question. I must confess that on rare occasions, I have allowed myself to entertain that hypothesis. And I have said, that's too controversial for me to even think about right now. Let me just deal with the simpler ones and get less into trouble and wait for the final technology to occur, and then a real breakthrough occur, and then pose that question. But it's a great question.
Yes, indeed. I think it's about as far as we're going to get with that one, aren't we? I agree. It's an absolutely fantastic question. There's a Ruth Hiles. I don't know whether she can be unmuted. And were you ever concerned that introducing mediumship into the equation, which to date is considered unproven, would just ipso facto undermine the experiments? I mean, this must have been the great moment. You bring a medium into a laboratory, good heavens.
Yes. The answer is that because I've been doing research with mediums for over 20 years and have done ever more controlled experiments, plus others have continued to do this work as well, such as Julie Beischel at the Windbridge Institute, or did a postdoc with me, and she does beautiful research. I know that not all mediums are frauds, and that some mediums are really evidence-based. There are fantastic mediums that I've had the privilege to work with, and they deserve to be honored, and they deserve to be heard, and they deserve to participate. Having said that, the only way you're ultimately going to prove this is to have this done with non-mediums. And that is the latest design of the next multi-center study that we're going to do. Because what we're going to be doing is having a set of hypothesized participants primed to be participating in the research, but then the mediums are no longer involved. What happens is that individual experimenters, be they skeptics or not, they will create the code of whether the hypothesized PMPs are supposed to go to lab A or lab B, or room A or room B, whichever the condition is, and only they will have the code. What they will then do is remotely, in a separate room, start a computer program which gives the instructions to the spirit team where they're supposed to go. So the spirit team is primed, at 7 o'clock or 8 o'clock in general, but they know the research is taking place, to go into the room and wait for the computer to come on, which will instruct them whether they're supposed to go to A or B. But the only people who will actually know and be actually controlling this, because they're the ones starting the program, are separate experimenters. And everybody else is blind, including the mediums. So the mediums don't know where the spirits are supposed to be going. And if all of this is true, the results should work just as well. So now the question then becomes, then the super side people would say, yeah, but the medium worked with the spirits before and they still had a relationship. So maybe the medium's mind is reading the mind of the experimenter, and then she's telling the spirits what there is this level of fascination with very sophisticated, complicated ways around the survival hypothesis. But again, when you take near-death experiences and the reincarnation research and the lucid terminal lucidity and the after-death communications and the controlled mediumship reserve. When you put all this research together, you just can't explain it by that.
I think that is such an important point. That's the many little sticks put together. You can't go across a river on one stick, but if you've got all these damn sticks, it'll get you across the river. I think that is right. As we begin to come to a close, I'm afraid I'm going to read out Peter Bruin's joke and then ask a question. He's not got his head in his hands. You will see it's a knock-knock joke. Knock, knock. Who's there? Harry. Harry who? Harry Houdini.
Oh, I have never heard that.
I think he invented it. It has the ring of Peter's humor about it.
Oh, what a gift. Of all the things I could be gifted at the end of this talk is a knock-knock joke about Harry Houdini. And that's the level of joke that I can remember. So
Yes.
in the future, I am going to
You will
cite
remember
him.
it.
Yes, I will remember that. Yes, this has been really wonderful.
Well, this is great. And I'll give you one last tiny question from Peter, in fact, as it happens to be. And then we're just going to have to say goodbye because people are beginning to put things into the chat like, thank you for a fantastic talk, which I think is the very polite way of saying good night. Peter says that he's friendly with a couple of Navajos and he Indians, as we used to call them, and they've got that culture on your own doorstep there in Arizona. I think. Do you ever get out there with them and get into a sweat lodge?
Boy, what a beautiful question. And before I address that, it's very meaningful. I would just like to say I would love to see the kinds of questions and comments that people made on the chat. So Scott, if you could give me a copy of the chat, I'd really appreciate it, the text from the chat. Of course, I'll keep it confidential. Part of my enthusiasm for doing this work was to help not resurrect, but give credibility to some of the native traditions and their belief, for example, in ancestors and their honoring the connections between here and there. And that although drugs can facilitate that sometimes, it's not necessary. And when I moved to the Southwest, I happen to have a passion for Southwest art and Pacific Northwest Coast art. You can see all the artwork that Rhonda and I have collected over the years. We live it and breathe it, so to speak. My hope has been that it would feed back to and would help honor the cultures that refuse to give up those very special ideas. And so it's really nice that this question was asked at this point. For the record, no, I've stayed away from sweat lodges and psychedelics and so on. I get into enough trouble and get distracted by enough things with this work so that I honor those who share the experiences, but it's not something I partake with myself. Okay, well, look, thank you very much, Gary. And I mean, for a man who has the titles of 5 different scientific disciplines in your professorship, I think you're probably allowed not to be able to do absolutely everything. And I think my very last word actually could come from your old friend Anne Traherne, my predecessor. It's so refreshing to have a scientist who accepts wholeheartedly the evidence from mediumship and then studies it. And she ends, "You're marvelous, Gary." So that's you. So thank you very much indeed, Gary. That was absolutely wonderful. What an extraordinary life you had. And here we have the usual silent hand clap to thank you very much indeed for coming. We'll certainly get you back, if we may, for the next phase of your research. And I hope everybody's enjoyed it this evening. And I hope to see you all next Tuesday evening. But thanks, Gary. That was great. Good night, everybody. Good night.
Take care, Gary.